Hello, I'm Mike Wheeler, and this week we're going to talk about how to keep yourself safe and healthy at work. Objectives at the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain how body mechanics and ergonomics can impact your health, explain the best ways to protect your hearing, list the particulate inhalation hazards that can cause lung disease, describe how to protect yourself from inhalation hazards that cause lung disease, and explain the radiation dangers that can be associated with the welding trade. And also, there may or may not be a guy running a grinder outside my office door from time to time, so hopefully that doesn't come through on the microphone too badly. But let's get going. So ergonomics. Ergonomics is the science of fitting a workplace to a user's needs or specific physiology in order to make tasks safer and more efficient. Ergonomics is something that is very important for preventing repetitive motion injuries, but is often not thought about until the damage has been done. A table that's too low can cause lower back pain, strain, and injury. Part storage bin that requires you to reach out too far or too far back can cause shoulder issues when done repeatedly. You know, the story I always tell is I worked with a pipe welder who was really short, and his pipe welding table he made was very short because the guy was 5 feet tall. After he was done with whatever job, whatever big task it was, they moved that table out into the yard, and then 6 months later, somebody else needed a pipe welding table, so the forklift guys just grabbed that short table, brought it in, and this guy was 6'2", and by the end of the day, his back was wrecked because the table was too short for him. So little things like that can make a huge difference. And beyond injury prevention, ergonomics can reduce cycle time on specific tasks because it takes less time for the worker to do the job if the parts and tools are where they need them. So if you're not reaching for stuff, your job will be faster and safer. And ergonomics is a great example of how we can make things better for the worker and the employer if we can get all the involved parties together in the decision-making process. And that's really important because the end user, the person actually doing the work, needs to be involved in the process of figuring out how the work cell should be set up. Just because their physiology, everybody's physiology is different. My left shoulder is worse than my right shoulder is most days. So I have to be more careful with my left shoulder. Somebody else might not be that way. Common body injuries. So there's many common workplace injuries related to poor ergonomics or poor body mechanics. So as I mentioned before, back injuries are very common in the workplace. You want to lift with your legs, get the weight as close to your body as possible. Don't lift and twist at the same time. But ergonomically, if we store parts on shelves or benches that are at waist height, you can pick stuff up and put it down and never have to get your back out of the straight position. So how we store stuff from an ergonomic mindset can definitely help us reduce injuries. Shoulder and arms injuries are common as well and very difficult to treat and repair effectively. Rotator cuff injuries, which is your shoulder, can happen if workers have to repeatedly raise their arms too high or apply force with their arms extended. And then elbows, you've heard of tennis elbow. That's just the common term because that's where it was the most common. Those tendons in the elbow, repeated flexing, repeated motion can damage them as well. Wrist problems, which is primarily carpal tunnel syndrome, is very common. I don't know a single welder that's been in the trade for more than a few years that doesn't have some form of carpal tunnel, and it's something that progresses over time. And for me, I've got numbness in my if I'm working with a piece of equipment that I have to hold on to very tightly, I get numbness in my hands, or if I'm running something that vibrates, I get numbness in my hands really quickly. So operating tools that vibrate, needing to tightly grip things, repeated flexing of the wrist can cause the central carpal tunnel of the wrist to swell and put pressure on the medial nerve in the wrist. This can cause numbness and sometimes extreme pain, and if this keeps happening, the injury can become permanent. And I've worked with guys that unfortunately they didn't get numbness, they got excruciating pain to the point where they couldn't sleep at night, it hurt so bad. They can go in and repair carpal tunnel. The problem is if you go back to what you were doing that caused it, it'll come right back. So a lot of times these people that have really bad carpal tunnel, they might even have to change trades, which is why we want to fix the workplace to keep us from having to do that. So noise-related injuries. And we've talked about hearing protection before, but now we'll discuss how sound can damage your hearing. Noise or sound is measured in decibels, which is a measure of sound pressure. The human ear picks up sound through tiny hairs on a little organ called the cochlea. Sound pressure vibrates these hairs, and the nerve endings are attached to transmit that information to the brain. through the auditory nerve. Um, when these cochlear hairs are exposed to too much sound pressure and noise, they are permanently damaged. They will not repair themselves. This leads to reduced hearing, and this is proportional to the amount of noise they are exposed to, as well as the length of exposure. This is how OSHA sets their permissible exposure limits. Where you could have, X amount of decibels for 2 hours, or a lower amount of decibels for 8 hours. That's where they get it from. And noises, loud noises in the 120 decibel range. Every one of those damages your hearing. It's just usually the duration is so short they don't do a lot of damage, but it all damaged your hearing. It's all permanent damage. How do we solve that problem? Just by doing what we tell you to do, which is use hearing protection, use earmuffs or earplugs. Anytime you're around loud stuff, even when it's stuff you wouldn't really consider all that loud, you'll feel better at the end of the day if you've had something to protect your hearing. Lung diseases. So asbestos is still around, but there are other substances that can cause lung damage. Really, any particulate we're inhaling can cause lung damage if we get enough of it in us. Very small particles of many different substances can cause lung damage. You've heard people talk about black lung. That's what coal miners get from breathing in that very fine coal dust. Textile or clothing workers can get what's called brown lung, which is cotton fabric dust fibers. Same deal. They're very small particulate and they can get very deep in the lungs. And then people working in dusty environments can get silicosis from tiny particles of silica sand in the dirt or whatever you're working around. Foundries, where they use a lot of sand casting, they're exposed to a lot of silica, and that's where silicosis comes. Some mining operations, instead of coal, they end up with silicosis from the stone dust, the rock dust. So as welders, we're always breathing some kind of particulate, either welding smoke, grinding dust, or just the regular dust we're working outside on a job site. These very small particles can get deep enough in the lungs they can't be cleared through our, you can't cough them up, and they end up blocking our ability to absorb oxygen. The other thing, stuff like asbestos can do, is those tiny little fibers, they irritate the lung, and the lung ends up basically creating scar tissue around them. Every time it tries to repair itself through making scar tissue, it has a chance to form cancerous cells. And silicosis does the same thing. These little, they're little pieces of glass essentially that get into your lungs, and every time you breathe, they move and they make a tiny little cut, Your body tries to heal them over and greatly increase your chance of getting lung cancer. The way to avoid any of these dangers, if we can't get rid of them on the job site, is through proper respiratory protection. So always wear the appropriate PPE to protect your lungs from these dangers. In some cases, an N95 mask is great. Some stuff in an N95 mask isn't anywhere near enough, and you're going to need an actual respirator. Radiation exposure and welding. Other than UV radiation, which can cause skin cancer, there are other radiation sources you may work with or around in your welding career. The big one's radiographic testing of welds. So some welding operations require radiographic, which is called RT, testing or X-ray inspection to ensure the quality of the welds and that they are free from defects. Now they do that is they've got a special film that's sensitive to radioactivity and a radioactive source, which is an emitter, and they put the film on one side of the weld, they expose the source on the other, the radiation goes through the metal in the weld, and it creates a picture of it on this film. Now you got to think, how much radiation does it take to get through 4 inches of steel? And the answer is a lot. These radioactive sources they use in radiographic testing are very, very hot, and that's what we say when they're high emitters. They are treated very, very carefully because, a very little exposure to them can kill you. So there are some terrible horror stories about, and it's happened more than once, about people doing radiographic inspection, losing the source, like it falls off the mechanism they used to expose it. And there's one case where it got picked up by some security guard who was walking the lot where they were doing it the night after they did the testing, and there are these sources, they're these usually very highly polished, and they feel warm to the touch, so they're very unusual. So people pick them up and they take them home with them, and the whole family dies. So you got to be really careful with them. The RT tech is registered. They're all trained and registered through the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to know safe distances and all the protocols. So how you stay safe around this stuff is you follow their direction. They're going to set up barriers and boundaries for minimum safe distance. They're going to tell you when you're authorized to be in the area and when you're not authorized to be in the area. You need to listen to them. If they've got doorways blocked off, don't just go through the doorways. You know, you've got to listen to them because they're the experts. The other, and it's much less severe, the other place we're exposed to radiation is through tungsten grinding. So thoriated tungsten, most commonly is 2% thoriated. It's the ones with the red ends on them. It's been used for welding for decades, and it is actually slightly radioactive. It releases alpha particles. So tungsten is, you know, a hard object. It's pretty hard to inhale a chunk of tungsten. But when we grind it, when we're trying to sharpen it, we create a very fine dust. And this dust, because it contains thorium, is also an alpha emitter. And alpha particles, they really can't penetrate the skin. They're only dangerous if they can get inside of our body. So we don't want to breathe this dust. We don't want to, you know, eat our peanut butter and jelly sandwich with this dust all over our hands. We don't want to inhale it or ingest it. Because if it gets in your body, it can cause a lot of problems. If you're not inhaling it or ingesting it, the danger is quite low. So always wear respiratory protection when working around tungsten grinding stuff, and wash your hands as well whenever you're dealing with it. Most places are going to a non-alpha emitter, which like either cerium or lanthanum. At school we use 2% lanthanated, and it's not an alpha emitter. It's safe, but people are still using thoriated tungsten, probably will for another 20 years because it works really well. But there is a slight hazard associated with the dust of it. And I've got a page from the AWS in this week's assignments talking about the dangers and how to mitigate them. So wrap up, ergonomics and how it relates to our specific body mechanics is a critical method for making jobs safer, more efficient, more comfortable. Many injuries to our bodies are caused by overuse, misuse, repetitive use of our bodies. Many joint and tendon injuries are caused by these factors. Hearing loss from excessive noise is common and not repairable. Do everything you can to keep the noise level down. For some reason I don't have the lung disease header in here, but really you never want to be the primary filter for anything. So get a respirator if you're doing even if you think the dust isn't all that hazardous, you still don't want any kind of particulate in your lungs. And then radiation exposure in welding is rare, but it's a hazard we need to understand. If RT is being done on site, follow directions of the techs. They're trained to do the work safely and to keep you safe, and then protect yourself from fluorinated tungsten dust. It's not really something you have to worry about usually, but you know, realize not all dust is created equal, and grinder dust from thoriated tungsten is not good for you. Okay, that was this week. Here's the references, and I will see you in class.